Well, I don't feel like John Patrick needs any introduction, but, it's interesting as I look at some of his information. It's about his medical career and associate professor in clinical nutrition and development and at the University of Ottawa, and his medical training in London and work in the West Indies and research. But you know how we know John Patrick is an apologist, and he has equipped us, challenged us, and given us things to think about for 20 years, more than 20 years at CMDA. And then we're going to have John Robson with us. He's been in the media his whole life. He's a columnist. He's an invited professor at the University of Ottawa. He's a broadcaster on News Talk Radio in Canada, a blogger, a part-time internet entrepreneurial. He's got a very impressive resume, a BA and an MA in history from the University of Toronto, a PhD in American history from the University of Texas. But he's joining us to talk about his spiritual journey to Christ. He's got a fascinating story. John, you wrote me a note saying, let's do something different this time. And you actually want to bring one of your friends on to Christian Doctors Digest to talk about the topic of how to effectively present the good news of Jesus to intelligent unbelievers. And that friend's John Robson. He's with us. Robson, I've got to get saying that right without the I in it. John Robson, tell us a little bit of your story.
My story begins with an upbringing from very firmly atheist Protestants. And I use the phrase advisedly because my parents were non-believers, but they both rejected the Protestant tradition, and that was the one that I grew up being familiar with. To me, the Bible was the King James Bible, and it was a great work of English literature and important in understanding cultural history, but obviously it was a set of fairy tales, and mankind had evolved. We were material creatures. We didn't have souls. There was no afterlife. And like a great many people, my parents were a lot better than this philosophy. They did believe in morality, and they were very good and loving parents. But from a philosophical point of view, they were bleak nihilists. And I grew up accepting this picture of the universe without liking it very much. I read the Narnia Chronicles as a kid. They were slipped to me by a very religious grandmother, and I enjoyed them enormously and wished they were true, but it seemed to me that this was simply not possible. And on it went through early adulthood. And then it began with a long, dark night of the soul. I was working very hard at a job that I very much enjoyed, but my days were filled with toil, and I was always behind, and I would get home and snatch a few minutes of pleasure, this sort of materialist, hedonist sort of life, where I'd have a nightcap, go to bed, read something I wanted to read, and then fall asleep. And then it hit me very, very hard that the minutes were slipping by. It wasn't just that I wasn't getting enough of these wonderful moments. It was that they weren't really connected to one another. A moment of pleasure you couldn't enjoy before it arrived. When it arrived, it was gone in a quarter of a second. And I suddenly found myself staring into the materialist abyss and realizing that the vision of myself that I had always accepted was this bag of chemicals whose behavior was driven by the inexorable logic of the laws of physics and chemistry. What I did next was determined by a mathematical calculation of the existing state of the molecules and the particles and the electrical charges. And therefore that even my thoughts were not the connected and coherent behavior of a mind in control of its own environment, making decisions and assessing things, but simply this epiphenomenon from all these chemicals bubbling away and electrical reactions crackling, which of course was a hideous vision essentially of non-existence. As C.S. Lewis once put it, after his wife died, if she is not, if her soul has not survived death, then she never really existed, and I mistook a cloud of atoms for a human being. And once I came through that night and started thinking, well, I know this isn't true. I know that I exist. I know that I persist through time. I know it matters what I do, that there's a coherent moral connection between the past and the future, which again is something that most atheists actually believe. I started looking again at the evidence. And this is how I ended up meeting John Patrick, is because of a column that I wrote, which was called Why Taking History Seriously Can Make You Very Cross, in which I challenged others, as I challenged myself, to look afresh at the New Testament. We're so used to it. Everybody's used to it. It's so familiar, not just Christians, but non-believers in Western cultures. Oh yeah, that's that book full of the fairy stories about Jesus that you had to pretend to believe or else your parents or the church would beat you. And that's how they would dismiss it. And I said, well, hang on. Let's treat this as a historical document. I am, by training, a historian. That's what I was doing professionally. It's the background of my journalism and my documentaries. And I said, we have these writings that come down to us from actually very early in the first century. We now know they were not written 200 or 300 years later. What are they? They purport to be eyewitness accounts of basically incredible events that happened in the first century in the eastern end of the Mediterranean. But let's look at these as historical documents and ask ourselves, how can we account for these things? Again, C.S. Lewis says about Jesus, a lot of people will say, well, Jesus was a great moral teacher. Of course, he wasn't the Son of God or any of that superstitious nonsense, but he told us a lot of good things about how we should live, and Lewis says, no, that's the one thing you can't say about Christ, because he does expressly claim divinity. So he's either a liar, a lunatic, or the Lord. But of course, the modern non-believer cannot go up to Jesus and say, excuse me, I'd like to check you out on this one, because he's not accessible in the way that your next-door neighbor or your annoying brother-in-law is. But the gospel, I transfer the question to the Gospels, because they are available. You can pick up the New Testament, you can look at it. It is a faithful copy going back to handwritten documents that seem probably to have been recorded in some form or another during the life of some of the disciples, and certainly of St. Paul, obviously, the letters he wrote. And I ask, are these lies? Does the New Testament consist of a series of cunningly devised fables, as Peter puts it, at least in the King James Version? Does the Sermon on the Mount read like a lie? And if it's a lie, what's the purpose of it? I can understand an elaborate fraud in order to get money or power or something like that, but in order to get crucified upside down, it doesn't seem logical that a bunch of clever, dishonest men and women would conjure this story up in order to be shunned by their neighbors, stoned to death, and otherwise persecuted and killed. But if they're not lies, are they lunacy? When you hold the gospel in your hand, and we've all had experiences with various forms of mental instability or outright craziness in our lives, do we feel that the New Testament is another example of that? Is the Sermon on the Mount madness on the part either of the speaker or of the scribe? It contains much that is baffling and challenging, but it's not the rantings of a madman. And if it were, how would it have convinced all these people? Because Christians were persecuted right from the word go. They were shunned, they were scorned, they were feared, they were mocked, and yet the message continued to spread. And if we look at the Gospels from that point of view and we say, they're not a forgery, they're not deliberate deceit, and there are all kinds of reasons for thinking they're not, including that they didn't take pains to remove some of the inconsistencies that non-believers have jeered at down through the years. If you were forging these things, you'd made sure the story was matched exactly, and they don't. But they're also not lunacy. What does that leave? And what it leaves is the otherwise staggering possibility, but the most empirically sound one, which is that these really are eyewitness accounts, with all the frailties of human eyewitness accounts that one finds everywhere, including the court of law. But they are eyewitness accounts of events that were so incredible that the people who saw them and wrote them down could scarcely believe them, but that really did happen. And as Paul says in 1 Corinthians, he admits that this is, foolishness to the Greeks and a stumbling block to the Jews, but then he says, but he was seen by hundreds of people, most of whom are still alive. In short, if you don't believe what I'm saying, go ask these people, because they saw the risen Christ. And again, we can't do that today, obviously. These people are now, they've been dead for 1900 years. But at the time, this was an appeal to, not to credulity or superstition, but for skeptics to check the empirical record. And so my column and my standing challenge to people in the modern world, or invitation, you are empirically driven, you are skeptics, you like evidence-based decision-making, well, look at the Gospels and the fact that they persuaded the most cosmopolitan society that the ancient world had ever seen. The Romans were not a bunch of yokels. It's not like they didn't know where babies came from, or the Jews. I mean, that's why the story of the virgin birth is so incredible. When Joseph finds out that his wife is pregnant, his first thought is that it happened the obvious way. These people were not Hicks. And yet they were convinced by this otherwise preposterous story about a dead Jewish carpenter being God. The only way this could really have happened is if there was convincing evidence that overcame the obvious inherent skepticism as well as the political and religious hostility of the authorities to this claim.
Wow. John, you're not just a journalist, you're a preacher. That's a pretty good sermon. So let's get down to the crux of the matter then. How do you effectively present the good news of Jesus to intelligent unbelievers? And our members have colleagues and friends that would fit that category, who many do not know Christ. Let's go back to John Patrick for a moment, and I'll come back to you, John.
Well, this is beautiful because, first of all, I have a totally different memory of how we got to meet for the first time. But that, as he said, the gospel writers couldn't remember exactly right all the while. They didn't always agree with one another. But I think I met John first in a little lunchtime meeting, which was arranged by one of the few Christian journalists in Ottawa at the National Press Club. And then we had lunch together a few times. John was an atheist at that point, but he was open to argument, and I enjoyed that. And then he wrote this wonderful column, which I'm sure you've got a copy of now.
I do, yes.
You can send out to your many folk out there. But what interested me and made me want to get him along at this time, things changed over the years, and 2 or 3 years back, I asked John to take part in our summer program at Augustine for physicians. The physicians, by the way, love this guy. And I asked him because we were at the time of Magna Carta, and he's made a DVD on Magna Carta and freedom of speech and the freedoms that matter to the Western society. And I asked him the first time he came, how do I introduce you? And he didn't really wish to be named as a Christian. But he came again last year, and he admitted that he's now, as I knew from his column, willing to be labeled. Now, I suspect that, like Lewis, yes, he made the move from atheism to theism on a rational basis, but Christ coming to life in our lives, we can't explain that. And I don't think John can explain how he made that move either. But I'd be interested to see what his comment was, because I think we would do much better as Christians in the modern world saying to the atheist and the nothings, you can't understand what I'm talking about, and I can't make you understand. Only God can do that, but he will do if you search. But John, what do you say?
Well, yeah, I would have said when we met, I was not an atheist. I was a militant agnostic. I concluded that the question was insoluble.
A distinction without a difference, yeah. Mm.
But what happened, to see, in a way, and I agree, you can't make people understand. So the dwarves at the very end of the last battle who will not open their eyes and see that they're in Aslan's country. But you see, what happened to me is that the materialist foundation on which I stood collapsed horrifyingly under my feet. Partly, I've been reading G.K. Chesterton because he made such appropriate, these great bon mots about current events. But you have, as Lewis said, atheists have to be careful what they read. And so it was partly, I think, reading Chesterton, comparing what he was saying with my life. But it's when I realized that the materialist vision of oneself, essentially a series of unconnected tiny slices of time, that the idea of the self persisting even for 4 or 5 seconds, let alone over a period of years, is, in the materialist vision, that simply can't happen. You're just a set of chemical reactions which are connected by the laws of physics, not the laws of metaphysics, and by biochemistry, not by morality. And so if you see a man beating a child to death in the street and you do nothing, from the materialist point of view, the you who did nothing 5 minutes later has no connection with that incident that should cause you to feel guilt or shame. And one of the funny things, of course, about materialists is that they account for all their emotions as a trick of the genes. All my thoughts, all my impulses, they're not real, and then they act on them anyway. I mean, I've known people who would argue passionately that there was no truth, and they would not give in. What does it matter to you? But again, it's just determined. So the materialist vision is unsustainable, I think. It is simply because we know that we exist. We know that we have moral responsibilities. And So I think one of the ways you approach it is to say to people, well, you know there's right and wrong. You know that we may even disagree about what's right and wrong, but you know there are things that are right, and you know there are things that are wrong, and you know we have to try to do right things. Well, how do you know that? And how can that be true? How is it possible that certain things are just wrong? Even if the law doesn't say they're wrong, we know they're wrong. The laws in Nazi Germany can say it's okay to kill Jews, but we know in our hearts that it's wrong. How can there be a moral agent inside you? How can there be a ghost in the machine? Because you know there is one. You experience it yourself every day. Many atheists are passionately devoted to all manner of causes across the political spectrum. How can it matter what we do? You believe that we're just bags of meat following instructions that make us likely to pass on our DNA, and yet you don't act like you thought that. You can't act like you thought that. Something inside you prevents you from doing that. Well, what is it? How do you explain that? Because if you can show them that their views are not rational, because the big knock on Christianity is that it's irrational, that Christians are stupid and fearful people clinging to God and guns, as an American president once put it. And as I say about all kinds of political debates, if people think you're a clown, don't show up in a fright wig. So you challenge the moderns by showing them that what they're doing and thinking doesn't fit their own self-understanding. And you do it with a friendly smile, and you won't expect to reach everybody. And, of course, there are all kinds of reasons not to want to be a Christian, including that it will place rather severe demands on you if you really accept it. And John points out, at first, I was reluctant to be identified as a Christian, partly because of people's reactions, say, I'm a Christian and slam. But also, I was afraid of being mocked. And then I thought one day, this is the most important thing about me. If I deny him before men, I understand what the consequences will be, and I just have to be willing to do it. And in fact, they haven't been unpleasant, but if they had been, it wouldn't matter. So, there are people who are going to smell a rat the minute you start down this path, and you won't be able to reach them, at least not now. But God moves in mysterious ways, and we must respect that. But I say you challenge them, you meet them where they are. You say, empirically, there's right and wrong. But the materialist universe cannot contain these things. Therefore, the materialist explanation has something very major wrong with it. And you can't make it go away. You can't shut off your conscience. Therefore, it's real. Right and wrong are real. Your knowledge of them is real. And as a rational, self-respecting person, you need a theory of the universe that can account for the fact that right and wrong are enormously powerful and very plain.
John Patrick, how would you respond to that?
I would say amen. I was all the way. I mean, there's a lot of interesting things happening, which I hope your members, my brothers and sisters, are noting. And I'll interject them at this point. One is a phenomenon in Canada about a guy called Jordan Peterson, worth watching. A professor of psychology at the University of Toronto, who has been thinking about these things apparently for quite a long while, but not saying anything that would cause him any trouble. So he had big grants from the social sciences research councils who don't like Christians. He's a psychologist. Most academic psychologists are atheists. But what got to him was that the students were empty and meaningless, and that the nonsense about gender, choosing your own pronouns, choosing your own gender, got to him, and he said, I won't do it. And he took a lot of flack. He lost his grants, but he went on some sort of fundraising organization. John will know what it was, and he got the money, came back overnight, and he has hundreds of thousands of people watching his videos, and he's become a phenomenon. And he's very much on our side in terms of pre-evangelism. And I think it's pre-evangelism we need to focus on, which is what John was talking about just now. What do you need to believe to hold the position you currently hold, that there is no God, and still have the world that you know you really want? They can't do that. And he knows that. He's not yet explicitly Christian, but he can't avoid it in the long run, I think. He's a bit like Dalrymple, who's, I can't understand why he hasn't crossed the borderline either, but these people are there, and they're being honest. And in the Christian area, the thing that's amazed me over the last little while is the huge growth in interest in apologetics. Now, if I give a talk for CMDA or for CMDS or Christian organizations in general, I might get 100 people, but if you do one on apologetics, you'll get 500 or 1,000. And they'll be Christians. The first time I was asked to do this, I was taken by surprise because I went to a little place in the Fraser Valley, and I thought there'd be 100 people on a Saturday morning, and there were 1,500. And some of them had driven from Montana to be there for this conference. I wasn't the only speaker. And it was on apologetics. The younger generation want answers, but they don't want to be taken for another emotional ride. They want real content. Give them real content, and that's what the college does too. Yeah. We don't evangelize at all. We just tell them how to tell the story, and they go off to university, and they can take their colleagues on. I think my shorthand would be, as evangelicals, we think where we should feel, and we feel where we should think. We don't know how Christ brings us into his kingdom. We know we're given a choice. We say yes, and we know something has happened. It's not objective in our modern world. It's objective internally. But then when we go to church on Sunday morning, instead of doing what the New Testament tells us to do, which is to think carefully, which is usually going to make you feel terrible until you confess, repent, and move on, we want to feel good. So we have feel-good Sunday mornings, and we have, this is the argument sign here, you're a Christian, evangelism. Those are the wrong way around.
Yeah. John Robson, tell me how your life changed when all this happened. Sorry, I interrupted you. Maybe you...
That's my sermon for the day, so to speak. You're talking to John Robson at that point, huh?
Yes.
In many respects, I would say that my life didn't change. I've been very busy with a lot of things that I'm still very busy with. But I think two things happened. I would say one was this kind of internal feel-good thing, which has happened to me a number of times in my life when I've adopted a view that I thought would prove unpopular, would see me shunned, and would be dragging it around like Jacob Marley's chain. And instead I felt lighter. I felt that I had removed a burden from my life, the effort not to follow some thoughts where they really needed to follow. And I would say the second thing is just and this doesn't come easily to me. Remember Bob Hope said, humility, I'll pass, And I say, but the thing about humility is that I've heard that it's good, but I really don't have any firsthand experience of what it might be like. But there has been a bit of an ability to be more pleasant to other people, because I recognize that not only do I have more failings than I would like to think, but that my failings are no more excusable than other people's just because they happen to be mine. It's like if you play golf, which I don't advise. You hit 3 or 4 good shots in a round, and you think, that's the real me, and you hit 70 or 80 bad or pathetic shots, and think, there's something else happened. So I've been more inclined to look at my own decisions and behavior in that way, and realize that the best shots are not the real me, and the bad ones the consequence of wind or uneven ground. And I think that probably has made me a little bit less obnoxious. You'd have to ask the people around me that might say otherwise.
John Patrick, you want to comment on that? Is the other John here less obnoxious? That's where we're at.
We could argue as to who is the most obnoxious of the two of us.
That's why you all get along so well together, right?
I think from the beginning we enjoyed the fact that we were interested in the argument, and we didn't really care what was said.
Yeah.
Which is what a university should be like.
Yeah.
And as C.S. Lewis again says, that I tend not to judge very harshly those sins to which I am not attracted. But certainly I think the other John and I are similar enough that I understand much of his virtues and of the few drawbacks that he's occasionally exhibited.
This has been delightful. Listen, guys, I want to thank you for spending some time with us, and definitely want to mention Augustine College and thank John Patrick for the tremendous impact that's had. And John Robson, we got to get you back on and hear some more of this. You've been a delight to get to know, and hear more about your journey would be wonderful. So thank you for
Anybody wanting a CMDA after dinner speaker, he's very good.
Yeah, you don't have to convince me of that. May God bless both you guys, and look forward to the next time we get together.
Great. Thank you.
if you'd like to keep up with both of these guys, they have great websites where you can do that. John Robson, ROBSON.ca, johnrobson.ca, and you can follow him online. And, of course, johnpatrick.ca, you can follow him as well. And then we've got some great resources when you're traveling and you want your mind stimulated on those long trips. Get the Best of John Patrick, Volume 1 or Volume 2. These are CD sets, and they've got John's best talks. And, as you know, if you've heard John, you can't absorb it all on one pass or two passes or three passes. You need to get back into it and remember all the insights he's given. And then I encourage you to also think about, as a gift for someone who is an intelligent unbeliever, Dick Swinson's book, More Than Meets the Eye. I think that's a great book to pass off a lot of scientific insights on proving God and just great apologetics as well. And all that's available here at CMDA at 888-230-2637, or just go online at cmda.org.